Okay, what I'm going to do in this video is a quick run through of the chakras from its the initial awakening of the chakras and all the way up to their more full, complete opening. And of course, now to talk about the chakras, you want to talk about also the prana and the kundalini. So I will talk about those as well. I'm going to restrict myself to those energies. But there are other energies. A crucial one is the will, energy of the will. I've talked about that in other videos, and also the prana. So there are a lot of important points to be made, and I can't make them all. And some of them are not strictly about the chakras that need to be made. And I'm going to try to skip as much of that as possible and cover those in other videos. In fact, my main contribution, I feel, is actually about what the essence of the ego is, and the true ego, and the true self, which is in other videos. And I'm going to make one more video about those, and that will be probably my most important video. The reason that I might hesitate to say this video is quite as important is that there's a lot of people who've written a lot of things about the chakras, and I don't find anything terribly wrong about it. You know, I agree with most all of it. I wouldn't, not all of it, but because I've spent decades with this stuff, I'm well aware of how its developmental process takes place. And so that's what I want to talk about, how this changes over time and its relationship to the Hindu enlightenment of being consciousness-bliss. And so that's what I'll do. But I will start off with what each chakra is. And I have this lovely, someone made this lovely little diagram. And I love the simplicity of this. And I'll show you. I don't know if you'll get that, if I hold that up. But anyhow, they've got this cute girl. There's a few versions of this, but I like this one with this cute girl. And just the simplicity of it is so nice. And because I'll tell you, I could talk about this for hours, these chakras. Honestly, I think I've read less than 3 pages if you put everything together that I read. Because I'll read a paragraph from some book and basically roll my eyes for a lot of it. So I've read virtually nothing about them. But I've had an enormous amount of experience because I'm almost always aware from which chakra I'm operating out of, particularly now. Well, for the last couple decades. All right, so this is what's on this symbol diagram, and I'll elaborate a little bit because it's a little bit too simple. Some of it, it's just funny. I love it. So the very bottom chakra, there is a hierarchy to all this in a sense. There is a hierarchy, a developmental hierarchy. And so the very bottom one, they have down I am. And that also, of course, is the sex chakra, and also, I think, power. That was my experience with both of those. So gotta be careful of that combination. And then the next one up, I feel, and then I do, the will, you see, and yes, and then the heart, and it says, I love. And now it's interesting, the separation from I feel from I love, you know, I found that quite interesting. I'm telling you the truth, I didn't even know this one you would call it I feel. then it was sentiment. I learned that only. I didn't know what that second chakra was. And I mean, you know, identifying it like that. And but I found out, but this is just reopened in a more full way recently, and it's so charming. I'll talk a little bit about that. Then proceeding up, so you have I love the heart, and of course that's the deep love. Yeah, I mean that's, and the will has its own love. I'll talk about that maybe. And then it says I speak. Now this, I speak, really it has a lot to do with your relationships. Then I see, and of course, ultimately, the Hindu enlightenment, you're going to see God. And you can see that very early on, too, long before you come upon the Hindu enlightenment. So, and then I understand. And this one, of course, this is, some of these, it's not a good, saying in the heart I love, that's, they got it in those two words, love, that one word. And this one, for one thing, it unites all the others, and it almost forces them, some of them. And that was my experience, and someone else I know almost forces it. And so you get have a couple things out of here, several things out of here that are important. Witness consciousness and this being consciousness bliss, this experience of being that you don't get until all of them are open. Quite different than what people are describing as being present, which is so important, being present. I still need to work on being present. And what else? So anyhow, that's the basics of them. And now I want to talk about how they open up over time. And I want to talk about the Kundalini, you know, because it's the Kundalini that supposedly opens them. I think the Kundalini comes to them first, but the prana is what really pervades them after they're in their openness. And that's what's so beautiful. So, my first experience with Kundalini, you see, I've talked about back before the internet, back when no one knew anything about this sort of stuff. I mean, unless you came across some Eastern book by one of these gurus or something. So, and the only Eastern person I came across for the next 20 years basically was Krishnamurti, and he said nothing about it. He mentioned the word Kundalini once in a dismissive tone. I don't think he ever mentioned it. I certainly never read anything. So, hence talking about the chakras. So, I'm going to start with the Kundalini because that was my first experience. And this is like in my mid-teens. Now, even before then, of course, well, I had spiritual experiences, aware of something transcendent and something, you know, just immense beauty. I think one of the earliest I had was this great intelligence in the sky. I use the word intelligence now, but I was only like 6 or 7. And this transcendent intelligence. It was on a beach. We were in Europe at the time, in Germany. We lived in Germany many years, moved there. And I think it was on that famous Omaha Beach. Omaha Beach, yeah. Is that the right name? And so anyhow, looking up in the sky and seeing that there. So I had in my life several, in my early youth, several encounters with something extraordinary. But the first Kundalini, that was this pain in my left leg that I was always, because I used to jog, and this is like my mid-teens and early teens maybe, and a lot. And then there would be this particular pain, and I'd massage my muscles to see if that had anything to do with it. Nothing to do with it. Now, I never would have thought of this as Kundalini, if not until, it was only about a year ago. I read someone saying that, someone said in Facebook, he said, the Kundalini isn't really sitting at the base of your spine. said it's all the way, I don't know where he said it, but I don't think he said it's in your feet, but somewhere that it's, you know, I don't know, he said, because it arises from, he says your first experiences might be coming up your left leg. If he hadn't said left leg, if he came up, in fact, I hadn't even remembered this when he first said it. I wrote back a comment. I said that's nonsense. It's all coming from the base of your spine. Basically, I said it was nonsense. And it's coming from the base of your spine, you know. And of course, I had so much experience of it coming from up there. And but then I remembered that I had that pain in my left leg. If he had said both legs or the right leg, I would have continued to dismiss the whole idea. But it was that peculiar pain I could not understand. It would only come for like an hour and then go away, but often in the morning, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And of course, back then when you're a kid and you do all these sports and all that, you hurt yourself all the time. So I didn't think anything of that there's any problem. Just you have pains all the time when you do things, and when you're young, so anyhow. So I wrote back and, I said, I remember this, you're right. And so anyhow, but be that as it is. Well, I wanted to mention that because a lot of people in the initial Kundalini will have physical pain. It's basically the only place I felt physical pain. I did have a little back here, Krishnamurti had a whole lot back here of pain. And I mentioned him because he's one of the few people I encountered. I'm not necessarily recommending him. He was the first one I encountered for many years. He was my only influence. And so a lot of people have physical pain all over, terrible pain, that even possibly causing some sort of medical problems. I didn't have that, luckily. And just that pain in the left leg. And of course, pressures in the head. We'll talk about that later. I had those, and not to the point of pain. So anyhow, so then, now, what would I say? Oh, well, the first chakra is sex. I wouldn't describe that in detail. But my experience of that in my mid-teens was that I was meditating and never read anything about meditation. I actually first recall of meditating was when I was 6 years old, 6 or 7. I was sitting and sitting silently, deliberately, and to be aware of everything. And anyhow, I found that interesting because it was so similar to my meditations many years later. And so I was meditating, and that must have been that chakra because my entire body was like one huge sexual organ for just a short while, 10, 15 minutes or something like that. Now, when you read nothing about that, and you have no idea what these chakras are, no idea, never heard the word, Kundalini at that time or chakras, and didn't hear about chakras for probably 20 more years. And so anyhow, that first one is also opens up this sexual, as a big sexual component. I mentioned that, one reason I'm mentioning this is because a number of people have said that it is, that the Kundalini energy is a sexual energy. And I disagree with that completely. It's just that the first chakra is sex. So if people say that, they probably had, it doesn't mean they haven't had the experience. It's just that if your first experience is that, you're going to tend to think that. So it's very experientially based to say that. But later on, it's quite clear it's not just that. Unless they say it's a transformed, energy, and then it's kind of hard to say they're wrong, but I don't think they are. It just once you know that that's that first chakra also has this sexual component to it, then you know that then it makes perfect sense. This Kundalini, this prana, and the will These are just energies of consciousness. And it just happens the first one is associated with sexuality, with the sexual experience. And so I had that. And then I started reading about some of Krishnamurti and started doing more meditations of being aware of thought and feeling. And I will say one thing about what I found is the most valuable thing in Krishnamurti's writings, and perhaps the only valuable thing, is that he said, you know, you want to be aware of your thoughts. He emphasized thought all the time. Now, he wasn't excluding feelings, but he doesn't specifically mention feelings. So maybe this insight probably not even his. I mean, he's not saying it so much. But the only reason you can't see all your thoughts clearly is because of the feelings. And I knew from a young age, well, now I'm going into meditation, I didn't want to do that in order to see all these things clearly, you have to see your feelings. You have to open up to all of your suffering so that you can't see subtly the movements of your mind if you're trying to avoid suffering, or if you're thinking about pleasant things, you know, moving toward one away from the other. Then, so that's very important, to be consciously aware that you need to be aware of your suffering. And I also mentioning this because people throughout all their chakras, this whole journey, you're going to find that there's some form of suffering in the opening of a lot of them, perhaps all of them, because they're all tied into consciousness, and consciousness has a lot of suffering. And especially if you're trying to open up completely. And so I thought, you know, when I was a young teenager, and hadn't read anything, I could see that the reason to a lot of people's problems is that they weren't facing their suffering. They didn't want to see, you know, when you're a teenager like I was, you know, a young teenager, you always have people, you're always concerned about how people see you and so forth like that. And so there's a lot of things people are avoiding at that age, and trying to see themselves in a good light, and so forth, and wanting others to see them in a good light. And so you have to face all that if you could be meditating. You know, and I was a teenager when I started this, you see. So anyhow, I've got to keep this on the clean, or I'll be talking forever. I've already written like a 150-page book, and that's leaving out most of my experiences. So if I start going into all this stuff, I'll never get done with the chakras. So anyhow, but that is important, to be facing suffering in the chakras. Everyone, you know, you see a lot of people on YouTube and Facebook groups talking about suffering, the suffering they go through. And you do in the opening of these chakras. You have to face all that suffering. A lot of people have this real trauma, you know, in their lifetimes, and they have to go through that, and it's a huge deal to open up their chakras. And they know that a lot of them know that their chakras will, in order to open up, be more fully enlightened, they have to face all this suffering. And okay, so now the next thing that happens is that you usually have some sort of extraordinary experience. And it's as if God planned it, that He wants you to see where you might go, what's out there. One reason is that if I hadn't seen all those spiritual experiences, knowing there's something of extraordinary, knowing there was something of extraordinary meaning, extraordinary, our source. What's in our source? The source. It's so extraordinary. So if I hadn't seen that, would I have faced all this suffering so readily, so completely? The center of my meditation, in some sense, seeing God, facing suffering, being aware of my thoughts because of Krishnamurti's influence. That was the wrong way to point. I might make a whole video just on Krishnamurti. He's pointing in the wrong direction. So, so you will have sometimes extraordinary experiences. And now people come away from, I'm seeing so many experiences where they said they were in bliss. You know, that's their description of it, in bliss. I never described any mind of being in bliss, because that's so petty compared to what you're going to see. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put that down. The bliss is important, and bliss is almost a suspension. If you have a lot of feeling and emotion in it, you haven't gone very far in bliss. If you're talking about the happiness of bliss, you haven't gone very far in bliss. Joy is a little closer, because joy talks a little bit about the energy of it all. You know, this joy is a little different than happiness. And bliss is a little bit more like joy, but sometimes with no feeling at all, because your consciousness is being partially suspended, you see. And you're getting ready to see what can't be seen, to be opened up to what can't be seen. So the bliss is important. If people are having experience of bliss, that's fantastic. That's a great development. So I'm sorry I put that down. But they'll have this, some sort of, and some of them are having extraordinary experiences, you know, seeing God. Hopefully that's what's happening. They're seeing something, or it's just something transcendent. See, almost all my experience at this point, most of them were soon after this and during this, before and after this, are seeing that there was something transcendent. I had multiple experiences of that. And so I was well aware there was something transcendent. And then had something even more extraordinary, which I don't want to go into all those. But I want to make a point about this. And of course, the chakras are probably involved in this, you know, one of them or the other. Some people have heart openings as their first experience, you know. That sounds lovely. I've even heard someone, you know, a couple of people talk about, you know, God's love coming, you know, this love from God. That's one I've never had. Maybe because I'm not looking for it. I've had love of God, but God loving me, I've never experienced that, I don't think. But I don't feel any need for it. Maybe that's why God hasn't done that. All these decades of experiences, and there are people having some very interesting ones I'd love to have. And, but don't really matter to me. That should be one of the most important ones to you, I think. I don't know why I don't. It never occurred to me. So let's see. Oh yes, now this is the point about that. This is what's happening. So many people I'm seeing on Facebook, and people writing dozens of books. Oh, they write book after book. They will have some sort of extraordinary experience. Wonderful. That's what happens in the beginning. And then they will have, it will give them a new perspective. Wonderful. Now they realize that there is this spiritual dimension lying below life, and that you can come upon that, and that it's something of extraordinary meaning. So now they know that. But what happens is that they see this sort of thing reflected in the saying of these gurus, and they think they have come upon this enlightenment. And what they've had is an enlightening experience, which is fantastic. I mean, you can turn their lives around. It does. It makes people spend the rest of their life pursuing religion because of the significance and beauty of these experiences. And it changes their whole perspective on life. Absolutely wonderful. It's not the Hindu enlightenment. The trouble is, these people think they're enlightened. And then they start saying, well, now I've got to embody that. When you become actually enlightened, it's embodied. There's no such thing as an enlightenment up here that isn't embodied. That is not the Hindu enlightenment. And now, you know, I don't want to, you know, these people are saying that, and that they're enlightened, or some of them won't say it because they're too humble, but They make it so obvious. They're repeating everything every enlightened person ever said, and writing books and books about it, and thinking that enlightenment is just this change in perspective. They know their experience is temporary, and their change in perspective is permanent, and their perspective is now. And of course, a lot of it, some of it from the experience, and some because they're reading all these spiritual books, and they're trying. They think they can see it in what they experienced, and in their perspective that resulted from it. So, but there's a couple of problems with this. One is that feeds your ego, and they talk about these things. Everyone thinks they're enlightened. That feeds their ego, and they simply haven't come to this enlightenment. And if you are not humble, if you think you're enlightened and you're not, and you don't have that humility, you make almost no progress. Bernadette Roberts, I'll be mentioning her because she wrote the book, The Experience of No Self, The Path to No Self. And I spent over 2 decades on a couple dozen retreats with her, and a lot of private conversations. And so I'll mention, she was big in my life. So I'll be mentioning her too, not again. So she says, once they become famous, they stop progressing. And it's so true. It's after decades, they write book after book, and decades later, they're still trying to embody what they saw. And they're making terrible progress. But it's good they're talking about embodiment, because that is what's needed next. If they could just throw out this idea that they're enlightened, and probably stop running around telling people, repeating these things from these great Eastern mystics or Western mystics, they would getting that feedback from everybody that they're enlightened when they're not. See, this is causing so much trouble. And the second thing is that they're doing something good. They're taking their experience and showing, you see, they don't just quote these people, but because they think they're enlightened, they will talk about their own tangential experiences coming out of that. Now, what happens in that is that they are in a different, when you become enlightened, you have a transformed state of consciousness. When I first came upon that, I could not believe that a human being could have such a consciousness. And so there is a transformation of consciousness where there's virtually no suffering, and any suffering leads to bliss. And then there's the continuous, almost continuous awareness of the divine. And so they're not having that. They're taking all these things that these gurus have reached this Hindu enlightenment, and they're translating it into their own experience, which is not the transformed state. And they're messing it up. They're saying it all wrong. One thing about this embodiment, one thing I heard, so many of them are saying now, is that the spiritual development and the psychological development are separate. No such thing. No such thing. They're developing here, and they're right that they need to embody it. This psychological dimension. It's good they're calling embodiments, because that's what the chakras are. I don't know why they're using that term when clearly they're. Anyhow, it's a good term to use. You want to embody it. It's because for some strange reasons, I don't know why the chakras are throughout the body. I mean, as a Westerner, I have all these intellectual ideas about what, I don't know why they're all not just in the head. Consciousness. Why it's in the body like that, to me, is a little bizarre, intellectually. But the experience is absolutely true. These chakras, these dimensions of consciousness throughout the body like that. And that's what these chakras are, the different dimensions of consciousness. And the reason you want to open them is that you want every dimension of yourself as a human being to be open to that divine. That's what you want. And of course, and to be good to others. But to be good to others, what would you most want them to have? Is this enlightenment. And so anyhow, people always are so afraid of desire. And if you desire spiritual things, if you don't desire this, you're crazy. You're nuts. You've taken this, what the people have said about desire, Buddha in Hinduism, and applied it in the wrong way, understand in the wrong way. If you don't desire this, you're nuts. So anyhow, if you know it's there, you'd naturally want that, and you'd want that for others. And so anyhow, they translated it into a way it's not. And then their ego is preventing them from progressing because they think that singular experience, or even I had a lot of experiences, and I still knew I wasn't aligned, probably because I didn't just have bliss. I saw, once you see God, you're not satisfied with anything on earth. Any sort of disenlightenment. That's why Buddha came to the Hindu enlightenment and knew there was more. So let's see. Oh yes, let's see, there's one other way they're messing it up. They're translating it wrong, and it's feeding their ego. So anyhow, let's forget that then. So you have these wonderful experiences, and that should lead you to start pursuing spirituality, meditating, etc. Right? Or whatever you want to do, whatever, going for walks in nature, I did all my meditating, almost all of it outdoors, and because I could see the transcendent in nature, and I'd be alone, watch my thoughts and feelings, and then turn and look at nature, and back and forth, each one silencing the other, and bringing silence and more sensitivity to the other. If you can watch everything in your thoughts and feelings, So anyhow, that's a good meditation. All right, so let's see. There's these extraordinary experiences. Oh, and then there's the dark night of the soul. And now when I went through that, I'd never heard of such a thing. Never heard of the Kundalini. And only now do I see that they are related. There are two parts to the dark night of the soul. What almost everyone is going through is not what St. John the Cross is. Well, he has two parts to it. Dark night of the senses and the dark night of the soul. And what people are going through is almost always just the dark night of the senses. Well, I won't say that. Maybe they're going through the dark night of the spirit as well. Dark night of the spirit. Oh, dark night of the senses, dark night of the spirit. He calls the whole thing dark night of the soul. I think that's how it goes. And I think he coined the phrase dark night of the soul 500 years ago or something. And so you should read a little of his stuff, or a lot of his stuff. Now, my experience, now I say that the Kundalini was involved, because when I hear other people's descriptions, and when I think about it, the dark night for me, there was this energy coming up, intense energy coming up, straight into my consciousness. And now a lot of people are having their dark night after some tragedy. Someone dies or something or other, and they go through, or they just are encountering some past trauma, and they're calling that a dark night. Essentially, it's not that. And in fact, Bernadette Roberts says it doesn't happen. That's not it. You know, period. This suffering, psychological suffering. And it wasn't for me. Her and me both, we were in good states. I was actually meditating. It was, for some reason, I wasn't reaching this clarity that I sometimes did. But I was in good state. I was by myself in a beautiful place, and I would meditate someplace beautiful. Well, at night, a lot of parts are beautiful. No people. And there was this energy coming up, and it was so intense. It was like twisting consciousness almost to the point of twisting it. Bring me close to the point of insanity for 6 months. It was terrible, absolutely terrible. And then I think it was too intense, and I think God stopped it for 6 months because it was so intense. And then again, 6 months of this intense stuff. And then it stopped again. 6 months later, it just about started and didn't. And I knew it would never come again. But I think the Kundalini is in that. Now, I have since the Bernadette Roberts, and I think most people, John of the Cross, this dark night does not come on because of suffering, psychological suffering, the loss of something or something like that. But I have seen people, someone I know really well, who had someone die and suffered, and I think they had that dark night at the same time. It triggered it. In fact, Krishnamurti, he asked when he made his centers, Krishnamurti centers, he said he wanted a library, and I only heard that he said one book he wanted in there, and that was St. John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul. And he commented about it in a personal way, saying it wasn't that bad. Well, 50 years later, it's easy to think that. But he had his because his brother died. And he said that perhaps it was the energy in that sorrow, that perhaps the intensity of that suffering gave the energy for transformation, you see. And he said, perhaps, one thing you have to understand about Krishnamurti is how much he is guessing about his own transformation. I've got to do a whole video on him, because he is misleading so many people. Because he doesn't understand his own transformation. And he thinks he transformed because he was made special. He believes someone like him comes about only every few hundred years or less. And that the reason he goes through all this is because he was chosen special. And we have to do it a totally different way that he did not do, through insight. It's all totally speculation. And he points out a lot of things that are very true, but twists the words, all the words that people are using. Oh my goodness, I don't want to go into all that. Okay. So, Dark Night of the Soul. So I now see that as part of the Kundalini. And but now, after all the suffering, came what St. John the Cross is really talking about is the dark night, or the second part. And so there are two parts for me, just like him. And the second part, what is that suffering? It's not psychological suffering. There's one source for that suffering, and that is you've lost all contact with God that you used to have. And if you had that contact with God and you lost it, you would realize that you've lost the most meaningful thing there is in life. Lost it, gone. And something if you can't lose something, Bernadette says, you can't lose something you haven't found. You have to find God first and then go through the dark night. But I'm not so sure. I think people can perhaps go through that loss. I'd like to think so without having had these extraordinary experiences. Because a lot of people have bliss, but few really have that revelation of God's existence. And it's a revelation because God has no form. You can see nothing. Okay, so so now what my other videos are about is why you lose that, how it's being lost, what's being lost. And this part, now during this phase, you feel almost nothing. You don't feel good, don't feel bad, but you've lost what's most valuable to you, what's most meaningful. That's the suffering. And it's intense. Intense because of the intensity of your love of God. And so knowing that meaning, I use the word meaning. But anyhow, so it's not an extraordinary time. In fact, it's a very quiet time. And relatively. But what's happening there is incredibly significant, because in that is where the ego, the actual structural ego is the energies. The ego actually isn't just the superficial idea you have that there of yourself, and even that there is a self. That's what all of the spiritual books are talking about. And it's so superficial. The ego is not that superficial stuff of what you're identified with. It's just that afterwards, during this, it's hard to see what's actually happening. And it's because it's so deep and subtle. And so it's the only explanation they seem to give, is that you're identified with the wrong thing, or you have this belief in that there is this separate self, and you're identified with it. And but that's trivial compared to what the ego actually is, and the depth in which the transformation takes place. It's not a change in perspective. You see, what they say, the way they describe it, it's being described by people who are genuinely enlightened, is that it can easily be turned into looking like it's nothing but a change in perspective, which it is not. That's so superficial, what you're thinking, what you identify with. It can affect you psychologically, but that's superficial. That psychological dimension, that whole thing is so superficial compared to the depths of these transformations and what you're coming upon. So that's my important contribution, and that's in the other videos, and I make one more video about it, and to a more complete picture of what's actually happening. So that quiet period is incredibly important. That's his dark night of the spirit. And so I went through 6, and they call it aridities, because your experience is arid like a desert, no moist, arid, another word what the Buddhists use is void. I think Buddha, according to Bernadette Roberts, and totally makes sense to me, is that Buddha is really pointing about a much further state, void. It talks about void, but I think this is what the Buddhists are talking about as void as well, as the same as this. What the Catholics are saying is arid like a desert. And so I went through a lot of that. 6 years, I think it was almost exactly 6 years. And then I think the next thing was that cloud descending down over me. Bernadette Roberts had a veil descend down over her. I had a cloud. I just used the word cloud. It just seemed a little bit more like a cloud. But it had the same reaction to both of us, had the same effect. You could hardly see anything. And I mean, your visual experience was like nothing. I mean, you could hardly see. And she couldn't read, you know, I could hardly read. And you recognize some ways your consciousness is transformed. I have that in other videos. I want to try to stick to the chakras. But this cloud, you see, it might be related to the prana. And that's a crucial thing about all of this. Okay, so let me directly talk about the prana for a second. The prana, you know, and it's the Hindu term, I think it means for them the same thing as life. And now it's like a cloud. And this is the astonishing thing about it. As a Westerner, I hate this description. It just doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem believable. But the experience is exactly that. That this cloud contains your very sense of life. Not just life as if when you see life, right? Your life, the essence of your living experience, your life. It seems to contain that. And now this is something I don't think I've seen anywhere except for this guy who wrote Kundalini and the Christian Spirituality. And he said that this, I think he was talking about the prana, because both the prana and the will, the same thing has happened to them. They're both, he used the term bonded. I was using bound, but bonded. That's, his name is Saint something. You know, not that he was a saint, you know, he's still alive. But he didn't seem to pull the thing together and see that that was really essentially what the ego is, one of the components. But this prana, he used the word bonded. And I've never seen anyone else talk like that. It is bonded with the conscious layer of consciousness, to the entire cycle nervous system. And it physically becomes liberated. They talk about liberation. This prana physically becomes liberated from its bonding and the will to the cycle nervous system and can pull out. And it's done that for me before. And when it pulls out completely, it's like your brain in every experience you've ever had is dying. Not all your experience is dying, but that dimension, that experiential dimension is dying. And that happened to me, you know, like you're dying. I don't feel like I'm dying. It's just that consciousness, the brain was as if it were an animal dying. All the life draining out of it. So there's no life in it. And so anyhow, that's this prana. So, but the significance of that is that's it being in there is an essential part of the ego. It's why your feelings are so intimate. Your life is in there. It's not that your feelings feel alive. Your life is in that dimension. And people know that. I know people feel that they're mostly living in thought and feeling. If you're not in thought and feeling, where, including perception, the whole thing's thought and feeling. You know, senses, all of that. Now when this light can pull out of that, and then it's hard to say where it goes. But of course it does eventually go back in, and to some degree, but it's always, now it's liberated, and that's what's going to beautifully open up your chakras. So the Kundalini does that. So anyhow, after that cloud came down, I think at one point I had this beautiful heart chakra opening. And now I'll talk about one specific experience in the heart chakra opening, because this is where you're going with all these chakras. It was like a tube coming down into my heart and opening out. Now a tube, you see, is empty inside. What is the tube itself? The tube itself was feeling. It was love. The feeling of love. and what's inside the tube. That is the transcendent. And that is God. And so these feelings open up. And inside, there's nothing that can be seen. You don't see something. God has no form. That's that love, formless love of something without form. But there's those feelings of love which give that human beauty, It's a human opening. The whole transformation, the whole enlightenment is a human enlightenment. It's so beautiful. The human being, every dimension of yourself as a human being is going to be opened up to that transcendent. God is beneath you in every way. Every way. And so, there was that beautiful love of God. And just at that time, I was given to read Ramakrishna. And what a beautiful man. And his love of God on every page. I could see it. And because I was, anyhow. And so, that's what you're going for in these chakras. You want to be opened up totally as a human being. And you can't open up totally if you're not opening up to all the suffering as well. You're a whole human being, yet you're going to open up to the whole thing. Up to and beyond it. Through and beyond. And have that beautiful human enlightenment. People, anyhow. So, then sometime afterwards, I will mention one thing about that. Because I had a lot of conversations at that point with Bernadette Roberts, been on a number of retreats. At that time, not a lot, but, I told her about that experience. And she pointed something out. She said, it's the first time you used the word God. Before I'd only used the word truth. She pointed one other thing out too. She said, because she knew, is the way I described it, that I had opened up out of love to love. She said, now if you can have that experience when you're suffering, you'll have gotten somewhere. And I had spent already decades, facing all my suffering. Aren't I doing that as well as I possibly could, facing this suffering? And of course, later you do open up to that in suffering. And that's your salvation in some sense, that you open up to that in all your suffering. So next to open up now, this feeling, the second one, opened up to God. And but the thing is that when it opened up to that transcendent, there was this sense of enormous meaning. And it is a feeling dimension. Like here there will be a seeing one, and here it's a feeling one, and here it's love. Brother Lawrence said there's a feeling one and a seeing one, and that was my experience. But it didn't say God. It said transcendent. I knew transcendent consciousness. It was opening up beyond consciousness to something beyond consciousness. And consciousness is what's experienced that enormous meaning. Consciousness is what's experiencing that love, but it's opening up to something transcendent that has no form, and so no experience. But Brother Lawrence said you're opening up to God. I mean, that you have this feeling, awareness of God. And I think Bernadette talked about it. She mentioned that at some point to me. And I said, well, where's God? Transcendent. So I asked myself, do they have a different definition of God than me? And are they having this same experience in the same way? And they're calling it God. But for some reason, I'm stopping short of that because my definition is different. And so that kind of bothered me in a sense. Why wasn't, is it that their definition is different than mine, or are they having a different experience? Well, I knew basically they were having the same experience, I could tell that. So anyhow, then, years later, let's see, is there more? Oh, let me talk about one more thing. Oh no, well, I've got to finish that about this chakra here. Because later, and I'm skipping in time then a bit, this one opened up, and it was a direct vision of God. It's a seeing experience, and I might talk more about just how that happened later. And that said God. But because this one didn't, I realized something about this one. See, I had been wondering what the definition of God was. I mean, why people were saying God when I wasn't about that one. And I thought maybe they're just being too liberal with the language and using God when they don't really know that. And but when this opens up, and the point is that you don't see something. It's not based on what you see, because you don't see anything. You're looking at the formless God, And so how do you know it's God? How did I know it was God? The only way you can know, it's revealed to you. God reveals himself to you. Herself, whatever. This is mystical knowledge. What no philosopher would like. You know with no evidence whatsoever. You know with absolute conviction. Is given to you from the other side. I will tell a story here, and I know I'm taking far longer on all this. I've got so far to go. And but anyhow, I'll tell one story about this. Teresa of Avila, she wrote a few books, and I forget which of the two books it was. I think she has, The Interior Castle and something about her life. Is it Avila or Avila? I don't know. And Teresa of Avila, or Teresa, I don't know how to pronounce the name, Avila. So it was so funny. So this was before I had this experience. She said she had this experience that God is within and God is without. And she said, how do you know that it's not, I forgot the word they used back several hundred years ago, that it's not some phantasm, some sentimental projection, and that you're actually seeing this. And she said, there's a way you know, a way you can tell. And she said, but first I have to go into this. And so she went into some of the subject. And I thought, for crying out loud, what is it? And then she came back to it and said, the way you know, there is a way you can know for certainty. And there's a way you can know whether or not it's just your imagination. And then she goes again, saying, but first I have to cover this. She did it again. I think she did it 3 times. And so at the end of it, you're going, for crying out loud, just tell us, how do you know? And then she gives the answer. She says, because of your absolute certainty. And I thought, what? Because of your absolute certainty and your absolute conviction, and that you'll never doubt it. And so now I know where she was coming from. It's not based on any evidence. That's why you can't doubt it. Well, you can doubt it. You can doubt anything. It doesn't stop you from doubting. But you know now. Now you know. So you know God exists. So anyhow, I just thought that was so funny. Oh my. Okay, so now before some of these chakras opened up, the upper ones. This one, by the way, took me a long time to open up because it's communication and it's a relationship. But it took me a long time to get that open. And so that's, I think, the key. I've heard a couple of the people talk about how that one's hard to open. And because of our very human relationships and how hard relationships can be sometimes. So that was a long time ago. There's several decades ago, 25 years ago, 30 years ago. So anyhow, finally that opened up around that long ago. And but before both of those, maybe even before the heart chakra, I read, and like I said about Kundalini, about chakras, I read virtually nothing about Kundalini. And so, but I did read this paragraph where they said that for full enlightenment, it has to come up, the Kundalini has to come up the middle of the spine. And they say there are different paths, and one of them is, like that snake curled around, you've probably seen that picture in medicine of the snake curled around that thing, that staff, whatever that was. And, the Kundalini takes this path like that. And it does, that's a good description, because that's experientially the way it sometimes feels. I know, even rare occasion now, but often when I used to meditate back in my early 20s, I would shake. And I found I shake because if my mind is in a certain direction, there's some sort of focus for some reason, and then I release it into silence, that's when I shake. It's as if that energy is in that, and then it's released. And there's a lot of, that is pretty much a way some of it is, Kundalini is blocked is by that, all that conscious activity. And and so, and he said real enlightenment is going straight up the spine. Well, I kind of looked at my body, and just then, it's funny how, then you look at that. But what came up for me was a little different. It was coming up the front of me. And not this straight up the spine, I don't have the, the thing is with these gurus talking about these chakras, and these pictures of these chakras, all the detail in them, and all the things they say about these chakras, you have to realize that some of these gurus, some of these Hindu mystics, have been sitting in a cave for 10 years. And they've been probably acutely aware of these things, seeing these things in details I've never seen, So so a lot of this stuff, but I think it's so far from the normal person's experience, whatever they're seeing in there. Their descriptions, how many petals these things have, and and those geometric figures, this one obviously has 2 petals, you feel it, and then you can say others, and this one having multiple petals, 1,000 petals and all of that. Yeah, I can kind of agree with that. But I just don't, And others of them are sitting in this, meditating for hours on end, day after day after day after day. So I don't doubt some of those things they're saying. Well, yeah, I doubt a little bit. I don't know. But it's very likely that they're seeing the enormous details in these chakras that the rest of us aren't. And then you see all these books talking about that, and people who haven't experienced it writing these books. And once you see what these different dimensions are, then you can write away as if, because you can write about each of these dimensions of consciousness, but they just have so little experience, most of those books, just throw them away. And, but not all of them. There's some good stuff in there. In fact, I'm sure there's probably a lot of good stuff in there. But I don't know how many personal experiential accounts like I'm giving there are. I don't know. You definitely see some all over Facebook, but a lot of them haven't gone very far, And one reason I've gone far is I'm kind of old. I've had a lot of time to go far. And so anyhow, so this kind of came up. It was almost more like a cloud. This line of Kundalini, and it might have been more associated with the prana. It gets a little difficult. There's big difference between the experience of the Kundalini and the prana, but it gets hard to detect later. And that is, the Kundalini is like this energy happening to you, as if you're, people describe it as a bolt of lightning going through them or something. And I mean, it's like almost like something exterior. It's this energy going through your body. And with the prana, and I see, I don't know if I've seen any real accounts of the prana in these YouTube things or in Facebook. Seeing it in the way I've seen it, experienced it, that it contains you. It seems to contain your very sense of life, and then Hindus call it life. And I read one paragraph in this book, probably 2 sentences. I should have bought the book for crying out loud. This Hindu said that the prana was more associated with enlightenment than the Kundalini, and I would agree with that. Anyhow, the Kundalini can come to these chakras, give you an experience, but the full opening of it, I think, is really the prana taking place. The prana that has been liberated and can now open up. And one thing I'll say about the Kundalini, it is not the spinal fluid. It is not some liquid. I mean, at some point it comes out of your head. I mean, a lot of people feel it coming out of their head. There's energy, it leaves the body. Now, I've seen pictures, they say it comes out of the head and then it comes back. There's some things I'm not sensitive enough to. I see it coming out the top. I don't see it making that circle. I know you come back to these chakras after these upper ones are open. You come back to them. And by the way, if you have the Kundalini coming out the top of your head, that chakra is barely open. I hate to say it. Don't think you're enlightened. That happens in the beginning for a lot of people. So don't think, oh, now my crown chakra is open. When it actually opens, you'll hardly even notice there's any Kundalini there at all, because it'll be just, everything becomes so natural after you reach the full opening of these things. And so I even felt the Kundalini come out of my body this way. I used to go into this church at night. Used to break it. I found I could, there's a Catholic church that I would go to sometimes, and I found I could slip my credit card in and pop up the lock. That old, just simple old thing of popping the lock open with a credit card. And I could come in at night when it was totally dark, only lit by the candles at the altar. You know how beautiful the church can be when it's only lit by those candles in front of the altar. So I would sit in there and meditate. That was a beautiful time. And so one day I was sitting there, those pews, and you can only sit up straight in the pews. Those wooden chairs, the wooden pews. My Kundalini came out of the base of my spine, left and right. It came up, just out like that. Came out a little ways and burst into flames. 2 little flames. And then it proceeded slowly, coming up, bursting again into flames. And again, bursting into flames. And by the time it got this high, bursting flames, I realized these flames were exactly opposite of my 7 chakras. Came all the way to the top. And the funny thing is that you can feel, of course, you feel its path. So there was this line coming out of the base of my spine and these flames. Now, at some point, I realized I was sitting there, for a while, and all these flames around me like that. And suddenly I realized this is the depiction of Shiva. Of course, now Shiva, that beautiful statue of Shiva is coming out of the base of his feet and coming, upward, But that statue is actually representing something else. An extraordinary experience I had. I saw that. Not the flames, but this Shiva is representing destruction and creation. And I've seen that creation. That was one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen. You have to see creation emanating out of that transcendent. I can't see how anyone would say that this creation is illusion after you see it emanating out of God. I don't see how they could say that. Well, there is a way, because the closer you get to God, God is truth. This world is not truth. And that was one of the only, what I would really describe as a revelation. There's lots of experiences of transcendence of the transcendent, but a revelation where God tells you something. One, God exists. The other, that for me, that this world is not truth. That was a shock. I mean, I don't know, I'm crying. It's just so moved. It's just so amazing. There's nothing bad in it at all. It was, I mean, there's no suffering in that. It's moving me now. It didn't move me then. You know, this emotional movement. You can't see those things you're being moved emotionally. It's true. So anyhow. So you know, in that standpoint, I can understand saying this illusion. I mean, if you compare it to truth, it's not truth, but it's not illusion either. This world is creation is a better way of saying it. And of course, anyhow, but you can't point to anything. You know, everything. That's another story. Don't want to go into that. Let's see. I think I was talking about this chakra. Well, let's see. What was I? How far along am I? Have I gotten? I'm talking about these chakras. Okay, so when that opens up, you have this direct vision of God. And then when this cloud kind of comes up, and so that's that. Then there's that progression. See, so at first you can have extraordinary experiences out of these chakras, but then at some point it is like the Hindus are saying, it's a progression from one to the other up, and an ascending order. And so if you're having these experiences, extraordinary experiences in the beginning, that's not quite yet it. And then there's this ascension, one chakra after the other. You know, for me, lasting 2 or 3 decades to do the whole thing, or a couple. And then finally it gets to the top, and you have that, I think I mentioned that already, witness consciousness. Now I only barely touched on it. So when it's ascended all the way to the top, you're finally opened all the way to the top. Then there's that being-consciousness-bliss. And now you haven't opened these things. In the opening of them, you also have to feel all those feelings, you see. So all of that embodiment work, where they're trying to face those feelings, those are all happening as you're opening up. You're not enlightened yet. You're not enlightened until you've gone all the way to the top with these chakras opening up, and this opening up, and you coming upon that being consciousness bliss. And that being is not this being present that they're all talking about. It has a different qualitative, totally different dimension. And should I say something about that? Well, I'm talking about the chakras, so I will. What happens now? This one, as I said, I've already said that this one, you see, forces open all the others. It doesn't force. Well, it seemed to force this one for me and my friend, and then you start going back down, opening them all up. Now, so that's that general progression. First up, open all the way, clearing out everything all the way down. And but during those those are those overall progressions. Meanwhile, after the heart and this, there are multiple times of going back to the heart and up, back to the heart and up, back to the heart, multiple times where your balance point is there, these chakras. And for me, when they talk about balancing the chakras, for me, I don't know about balancing a single one, balancing at that chakra point, that's true. Or balancing between two of them. Or balancing in the sense that your head's not pulling you in some direction, because of your thinking or because of your desire or something like that, pulling you out of where you're centered. And so you have to realize where you're naturally centered. People who can control these things, I'm not sure their ego's gone. There's a natural you are naturally centered in the beginning at one or two of these chakras, or even after this opens up, you start to open up all of them at once, and you can have more than one, balance it more than one. Balance, I mean, kind of that you are living out of that point, that you are, you grounded, I like that term. And so anyhow, so then there's that progression to back down, all the way down. Now, to me, I kept coming back to the heart and then back up, back to the heart and back up for a long time. And so when I started coming down lower, and it's only recently that it came back down all the way to the second and first chakra. In the first chakra, of course, there's that sex and power. And I kind of ignored the sex, and it went away fairly quick, 15 minutes maybe. And that power seemed to last a little longer, and it too seemed to have gone. At least that type of power, that experience of it. And but the second chakra, this feeling. And now for so long, I have been telling people, this move, because what is it that's of value in feeling? It's the intimacy of it. Now, once these chakras open up beyond feeling to that transcendent, your intimacy, you see, is going out of its bondedness to a psychonervous system, and it's coming into these chakras, your intimacy, experience of intimacy, to what they experience. Now, what they experience is feeling, only on the surface. But what your real thing now is that transcendent. And don't know how to phrase that. But then when this chakra feeling opened up, it was such a delight, such a joy. When this really opens up, Bernadette Roberts told me, said, in this unitive state, this initial Christian enlightenment, which is the same as that Hindu, I think. They don't have the same theological viewpoint on it, but it's clearly having the same experience, this Hindu enlightenment, being-consciousness-bliss. And she said, you can fall in love in this state. And I found that is so true. At the time she told me that, it was so long before, that it didn't seem like that's the direction it was going. I wasn't sure what to think about that. Falling in love sounds so childish, and it is. And so, she, and some later point, she said, much later, she said that Teresa of Avila was in love with St. John of the Cross. And I don't know how she knows that, but she would know, she could know things that she could tell what every experience I had. After I would have it and I'd come see her, I wouldn't say a thing about it, and she'd come up and tell me what her experience of it was, of that exact same experience. And she could see things. So anyhow, when this opened up for me just recently, it is so charming. It's like falling in love like a teenager can. You're opening up every dimension of yourself. Now, I don't know those feelings. When they say feeling, they might be talking about all sorts of feelings. And of course, now, I've already said that thing opened up to God already. And I had a lot of feeling, of course, in my life when I was a teenager. When I was in my early 20s, there was this famous psychic who lived in our area, and I just passed him on the sidewalk once, and I said hello to him, and he said, "You're too open down here." So I don't know. So it's not as if, you know. Of course, you know, when after that description, of course, you know, you can relate to these chakras, and so there's a lot of people who haven't even opened who are talking about the chakras. But of course, the point of them is to open them. And then at first it's, and I can tell some of these people who just, you know, they had some experience, think they're enlightened and haven't at all. You can tell that they are looking at their chakras, that it is this, looking at this. When these chakras open, you're looking out of them. You're not looking at them, you're looking out of them. Your view of the world is coming out of this dimension. And that's the beauty of it. Someone told me that when I was just beginning to see these chakras and have, you know, strong experiences there, you know, that it was more inward. And he said that later they go out. I didn't like the fact that I hadn't gotten there yet. But anyhow, I just kept that in the back of my mind. And then sure enough, eventually you look, hopefully it doesn't take too long, you're eventually looking out of them and out of all these dimensions. And so anyhow, so that's charming. That it's all feeling is superficial compared to that transcendent, you know, and you're living from this deeper place. You're living from, I should mention, there's one place deeper. When you know, and I experienced it this way, how's all your conscious experience, thought and feeling getting deeper and deeper within. And then when you get deep enough, it opens up into a dimension. See, thought and feeling are all coming from the senses and the intellect. What you see, what you feel, it's all coming from senses and the mind. But this deeper being never came in through the senses of the intellect. And that's one reason that there's this end of suffering, is that when you suffer, the longer you are living in that state, the longer you face your suffering, the quicker it comes into that pure being, peace and being. And and St. John the Cross, I think is talking about this, and he says it's as if there's a wall that these things can't penetrate. I don't like the idea of a wall, but yeah. Thought and feeling can't penetrate into that dimension of being, peace and being. And that's where you rest for the rest of your life after this transformation. After the ego is dismantled, not the idea of an ego being dismantled, but the actual biological dismantling of the ego. Is that your consciousness for the rest of your life rests on this peace and being. And all suffering, everything deep, including love. Anything goes deep, suffering goes in this pure peace and being, which can't be touched by thought and feeling. And below this peace and being is your openness to the transcendent, to God. And so you want to go. You want all that. And so that's almost a description of consciousness in that enlightened state. That's what, and the longer you live in there, the longer you're facing all of your human existence, everything, opening up in every way to your humanity. You know, we're human beings. Bernadette Roberts keeps saying to us, he says you already have a oneness with God. But in this transformation, well, I forget how she phrased that, but she said, God's first will for you is that you exist. He's created you as a human being. And And you're going to fight God on that, what you are as a human being. There's some things you want to see and some things you don't want to look at. It's this complete opening to you. What you are as a human being is how you open up to God. It is these different dimensions of your consciousness. It's your bare existence is resting on God. And so in this transformation, you live that. And this peace and being becomes more and more. Everything is flowing into that, and all that superficial layer is going. And Bernadette Roberts asked me once, very early in the process, she said, is there less tendency to go to do anything bad? And I don't think I don't think I'd ever do anything bad, ever did. I never did anything I thought would harm another person. And I answered her, I said, there's less of me to do bad. And she liked that answer. But this was early in stage. I think I gave her the answer that she would like. But now I can see it's true. That's what happens. There is less of you. This part up here, which has its desires, and which can cloud your understanding. Oh, yeah, I can still see that sometimes my desires can cloud and, cloud my judgment on what's good for others because of my own personal desire. See, that continues when the ego is gone. People are defining the ego in the wrong way. You want to define it in a way that is actually transforms, what actually transforms, and how is it you come upon this permanent awareness of God. And that's what that some forms of desire linger, sure, you want to clear those out. But that's not the essence of the ego. It's not the structural essence. It's not the depth of it. It's not what transforms. It's what's sloughed off later and throughout the whole process. So this opens up more and more, and then you're more easily open to the divine. And now my experience of the divine now is, I think, more this feeling than this seeing. They say you eventually see God everywhere all the time and everything. And now I feel it almost everywhere. It's more. I think it's more of a. It's hard to tell how I'm seeing it now. But once the chakra, this is opened up, all of your chakras are open and kind of harmonized. But I think what I'm feeling now is because this is recently opened up, and is again that feeling of knowing of that God is here. And I like the term Krishnamurti uses. There's something sacred here in the room, and I can see that, see it, feel it. I don't know how I'm seeing it. These things, it's hard to know how you see it. It's to know what you see. And so anyhow, that's what's involved in the human, in the Hindu enlightenment and the Catholic unitive state. Unitive state points to the will's transformation more than these other things. And the will is transformation is more involved in the dismantling of the ego than, so anyhow, I think, I experienced both of those transformations, the will and the chakras, and the prana, will and the prana and the kundalini. And so anyhow, it's worth it all. Oh my God. Life is so hard. And even after all of this, it's the big things that go down into this peace of being. Otherwise, life is still, you're cold or uncomfortable or ate too much or There's 101 things to get slightly miserable about. Life is still hard. People are still in stress, even in this condition. I'm retired now. If I was working, I can imagine I'd be under stress. This doesn't solve everything. Eventually, I'm sure it does. But when all deep suffering goes into this peace and bliss, that's a real salvation of sorts. And to know that you can't suffer deeply because God is below you, and this peace and being, this transformed consciousness, that I never would have guessed that a human being could live like this. I knew in light God, I had seen extraordinary things, so I was expecting something extraordinary. But that a human being could live in this transformed state is wonderful.